Hi everybody, it's Sally here, and today we're going to talk about maths, specifically with regard to tension swatches, tension pieces. There's been a lot of conversation going on the group over the last few days about tension squares, tension pieces, gauge swatches, whatever you like to call them, in wherever you are around the world. In the UK, they tend to be called tension squares, tension pieces. I think it's commonly called gauge or swatches elsewhere. However, we've gone over several times how to actually knit your tension pieces, especially if you're using the rulers. There's a green ruler, like that one. Or if you've got a mid-gauge machine, it's yellow, and chunky is blue. But we haven't gone into quite so much detail yet about what to do if you're having trouble getting the tension that you want. I think this is a hurdle that new machine knitters find quite difficult to overcome. And for some, particularly if they're hand knitters, can take a while to grasp the necessity of doing a tension piece. I mean, I'm a hand knitter. I've been hand knitting since I was a little girl, and I know that I normally pretty much knit to tension. So if I go and buy a ball of wool or balls of wool for a specific hand knit pattern, use the needle size they recommend, that my gauge or tension will come out pretty much as to what it should be according to the band on the ball of wool. However, on your knitting machine, you don't know what tension is going to come out. Each machine is different, each yarn is different, and what I get with a specific 4-ply cone on my machine with a stitch dial set at 7, somebody else might never achieve an exact matching tension, or they might need to have it set at 6, or they might need to have it set at 8. And until you've used your machine a lot and have knitted a lot of swatches or a lot of garments, you're not really going to get a feel for it until you've got that experience under your belt. So to begin with, knitting tension pieces is really important. Otherwise, you're just going to end up making garments that turn out to be completely the wrong size, completely the wrong shape, they don't fit, etc. And gauge becomes even more important when you move away from stocking stitch, because as you might have seen from some of the photographs I've posted on here, particularly things like tuck stitch and slip stitch will have a very dramatic effect on gauge or tension, and likewise fair isle, but to a lesser extent. Tuck and slip, tuck in particular, tend to make the piece much wider and shallower, whereas fair isle tends to make it narrower and elongate it. So if you're making a garment that's got, a pattern body and plain sleeves, you're going to need to do different tension pieces for each section of the knitting that you're going to do. But it still doesn't address the issue of what happens when you want to knit something, you haven't got the specific yarn to hand, and when you're sampling the one that you want to use in your project, you can't get anywhere near the tension. Well, it's reasonably easy to overcome this, especially when you're talking about fairly basic garment shapes. So what I've done to demonstrate this to you today is I've taken one of the pattern pieces from Cal 2, which was the very basic round neck sweater that we did a couple of years ago. But the purpose behind that pattern was to introduce you to the fundamental techniques of garment construction on a knitting machine and how to put it all together. I'd be the first to admit it's not the most exciting pattern in the world. It's a round neck sweater. Hey, not difficult. But as I said, the purpose behind it was to teach you the construction of machine knitted clothing so that you could get that experience and then use it to move on to other things. So how do we convert your tension on your swatch into the one that's in the pattern? Well, to do this, you need to do a little bit of mathematics to work out the ratio between your stitches to the required stitches and your rows to the required rows. And it's a little calculation which gives you a thing called a conversion factor, sometimes abbreviated to a CF. I put the instructions together in a document, which I will put into the folder or into the group when I've finished. And it's being in an Excel spreadsheet. For those of you that aren't familiar with Excel, Excel can perform mathematical functions and calculations for you. So if you are a bit mathematically challenged, you can just put the information into the boxes on the grid in the file, and it will calculate the sums for you. If not, you can use a calculator. But the most important thing to remember, that if you are going to use the calculation function within Excel, is do not overtype anything where I've put the box in yellow, because those are the areas, or the fields as they're called in Excel, where the calculation is sitting. The instruction for the program to calculate that divided by that sits in that box. So don't overwrite anything that's in a yellow box. So what you do is you take your knitting pattern and your swatch, and in the file you put your swatch stitch result in there. So in this case I'm going to use an example of 30 stitches, and in there you put the rows. So I've got my pretend swatch is 30 stitches and 44 rows, whereas the pattern for Cal 2 requires the tension to be 28 stitches and 40 rows. So I put those numbers in those boxes there. The required tension, 28 stitches and 40 rows. And then the Excel program will perform the sum, the division of those numbers. So if I do it on the calculator, just to prove that it does it correctly, 30 divided by 28 equals 1.071425. We're not going to bother with all those numbers, we'll just stick to 3 decimal places. And then on the rows, my pretend tension is 44, the required is 40, so 44 divided by 40 equals 1.100. And those then become your conversion factors. You will need to do a separate one for stitches and rows, because the ratio between the two numbers will be different. So don't forget, you have to do one for stitches and one for rows. And then once you've got those two conversion factors, you can then go back to the pattern, and for every section of the pattern that's giving you instructions for what to do with stitches, you multiply this time the given number of stitches in the pattern by the conversion factor, and then it will tell you how many to cast on, cast off, do shoulders, do neck, etc. So what I've got here is I've taken the 38-inch size for Cal 2 and printed it off, and we'll run through this together so you can see what I'm talking about. So let's look at the stitch conversions first. My conversion factor for the stitches is 1.071. So at the bottom of the back piece it says cast on 140 stitches. So if I take 140 and multiply it by 1.071, it gives me a number of 149.94. Well, I'm obviously going to round that up to 150. Now, I always work with even numbers, so I would always suggest you round up or round down to the nearest even number. But if you're happy to work with an odd number, be my guest. You can also use this little section on the Excel file to as a stitch row calculator if you haven't got a calculator handy. And if you type 140 in that box there and 1.071 in there, it will then give you the answer. In this case it's 150. I've used a different number in this one. It's 164 by 1.071, it comes to 175. But on this pattern it's 150. So you then will knit the straight up until you get to the armhole decrease. Now 7 stitches to the inch, you're not really going to want to play around with that. I mean, I can multiply it 7 times 1.071 comes to 7.494. You can't cast off 7.5 stitches. It's got to be either 7 or 8, and that's still closer to 7, so I would leave that as 7. So that then means that at this point where you're going to cast off, don't forget you do it on both sides. So you've got 150 minus 7 is 136. So here you'll have 136 stitches when you get up to this point where you've decreased in for the armhole. The next bit, we're doing the back first, is when you get up to do the shoulder and the neck. So 40, which is the shoulder measurement on both sides, times 1.071 comes to 42.84. We'll round that down to 42. That's 42 on both sides. So that then leaves 46 stitches. 46 times 1.071 is 49.2. So we make that 50. But check those against that. So 42 plus 42 plus 50 is 134 and not 136. This is because you've been rounding down. So now you can either make both of those 43 and leave that at 50, or you could leave those two at 42 and make that one 52. It's not really going to make much odds which way round you do it. So let's make that one 52. That's now 52. So that's it as far as the stitches are concerned for your back piece. I'll talk about the round neck in a minute. So let's go now to the rows. So your row conversion factor is 1.1. So 30-foot rows for the rib, 30 times 1.1 is 33. Well, I'll round that up to 34. 140 times 1.1 is 154. 90 times 1.1 is 99, so I'll round that up to 100. And that's the rows taken care of. And now on the front part, you'll obviously knit it exactly the same up until you get to here, which is the front neck shaping, which you were going to do on row count 50. So 50 times 1.1 is 55. So whether you do it on 54 or 56 doesn't really matter. Let's make it 56. So we round that up because we rounded that one up. And then you've got to do your centre neck shaping. Now, I normally take the width of the back neck, which in this case is 52, and then I divide it by 4. So divide by 4 is conveniently, it's 13. So I will cast off 13 either side of centre, and then 13 on every row, one on every row 13 times, and that will give me my front neck shaping. If that number didn't divide exactly by 4, say for example I would taken it to 50 instead of 52, 50 divided by 4 is obviously going to be 12.5, so I could make that 13 and just cast off one every row 12 times, which give me 25 on either side, 2 of those obviously coming up to 50. So that is how you recalculate using the conversion factors for your pattern. It's really quite straightforward. Just make sure you get the maths right in here, either using a calculator or using a little grid, and then just do a few little calculations. When it gets to sleeves, it gets slightly trickier because you've obviously got some shaping involved. But let's start off and do the basics first. So it says cast on 66 stitches, 66 times 1.071 comes to 70.6, that'll be 70. And 126 at the top here times 1.071 is 134.9. I'll probably tend to round that up, whoops, as it's so close to 135. I'll retrieve my red pen. I find it easier when doing these to use obviously a different colour, in this case red, so that I can see which numbers I should be following. So I'm going to round that up to 136. So now the number of increases you've got to do is the difference between the stitches at the top and the stitches at the bottom. So 136 minus 70 is 66. And because you're increasing on both sides, so that's 2 increases each time, you divide that by 2. So that's 33. So that's 33 increases on each side. So instead of increasing 30 times, I'm going to be increasing 33 times. So make that note there. So how frequently am I going to have to increase? On the old pattern, it was every 5th row. It might not come out the same if you're adjusting. It might be every 4th row, it might be every 6th, but you need to work it out. So again, we need to look at the number of rows. The rib is 20, 20 times 1.1, which is the row conversion, so that's 22. And then the total row count was 168. 168 times 1.1 comes up to 184. 184. What I need to do now is to take the total number of rows and divide it by the number of times I've got to increase. 184 divided by 33 equals 5.575. So that means that you would take that number and always round it down. So you'd be increasing every 5th row. So that stays the same. You're not going to change that at all. So 33, the number of increases you're going to do times 5, how frequently you're going to do it, comes up to 165. So that means you finish your increasing at row count 165, and then you've got this little straight piece up the top here, which is the area that normally goes into this part of the sleeve when you sew it all together. So that's it. That's how you use conversion factors to take a pattern that you can't match, but then match it to your tension. It's really quite straightforward. I will put all the information into the files. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I need to say. You can use this method to recalculate for a completely different gauge. Say if you're going to do chunky or something on your mid gauge using an Aran or a DK yarn or even a chunky yarn. But to be perfectly honest, I would probably prefer to work with the dimensions and just taking the dimensions of the width here, the depth, the width of the top of the sleeve, the cuff width, and recalculate it from scratch. But you could use the conversion factors, but just approach it with a little bit of caution and just make sure that all the numbers add up together when you've finished. I hope I haven't made this sound too scary. It isn't really. Maybe just take a couple of patterns and give it a go. And if you sort of start to do a few sums and end up with some fairly strange numbers, like it's telling you to cast on 600 stitches or you only need to knit 40 rows, then maybe you might realise that there's something wrong. But as long as you put your swatch stitches and rows in there and the required stitches and rows in there, then this little chart will calculate the two conversion factors for you, and then you just need to apply it to the schematic of your pattern. Oh yeah, I suppose I could say about curved shapes. This method works pretty well where you've got a fairly basic schematic like this, but when you get into the realms of curved shapes for the top of set-in sleeves, or I was trying to think what else is curved. It's mainly set-in sleeves. It might get a little bit tricky, and that might be where you'd be better off using a shaping device. I don't really ever tend to knit set-in sleeves. I don't like them. I don't like the way they sit on me, so I tend to use this simplified version of a set-in sleeve. I mean, this is really a modified drop shoulder pattern. It's just that by moving the top of the sleeve inwards from the body, it means that that seam where the sleeve joins the body doesn't fall halfway down your upper arm or even down as almost as far as your elbow as it can in some cases. It brings it a bit further up to your true shoulder, and it just makes the garment sit better. I do quite like raglans. You could use this method to recalculate a raglan shaping, because you'll be going up to here and then decreasing across like that for your raglan. But again, you just need to check how many decreases you're doing on this slope against how many rows, and just check that the frequency at which you're going to be making those decreases sits in with the overall row count. Likewise with V-necks, if you're going to have a V-neck down here, look at the row count from there to there and the number of stitches you've got to decrease, and just check where you're going to be making those decreases each time. Do give it a go. If you still struggle with it, come back and let me know, and I'll see if I can explain it in any better detail for you. I hope you've been able to hear me over the noise of the lawnmower outside. It's typical that as soon as I come up here to do a video, my husband decides he's going to mow the grass. That it's blinking freezing here today in the UK. And it's supposed to be, we've got a bank holiday, a day off work for those that still work today, and it's cold, too cold to be sitting out in the garden. So enjoy playing with conversion factors.